I beg you to lead a life worthy of the calling to which you have been called. Please be seated. So in our reading from Ephesians today, we get these words from Paul to the community of Christians in the town of Ephesus. To lead a life worthy of the calling to which you have been called. He's writing this letter to this community that he hopes will be shaped and formed deeper and deeper into the image and likeness of Christ. It's an idealistic letter, a letter of hope, a letter of possibility of what this small community in Ephesus and all of the scattered Christian communities can become. It's a vision of Jesus' dream for what his people could be and would be eventually. And while there is this sort of idealism in this letter, I also experience in Paul a refreshing dose of realism. Because as he talks about living this calling to which we're called, living this life that is utterly transformed and reflective of God's love, that there's no one single path. There's no one single blueprint for what that life looks like. Paul isn't giving the people of Ephesus a checklist, but is acknowledging the various gifts that they have, the differences among them, the different ways that they can and will express the love of God that has been given to them. And while I find that is no single blueprint refreshing, it's also a challenge. And the challenge in it is the challenge of discernment, of knowing how it is that we are being called to reflect God's love into the places we find ourselves over the course of our lives. This is the work of finding what our vocation is, what our callings are, what it is, who it is that we are called to be, and what it is that we are called to do. And that's no easy thing. Over the first couple months of my being here, I've had the gift and the opportunity to meet one-on-one or with a couple of you or families individually at a time to spend an hour longer just in conversation, getting to know you, giving you the chance to get to know me. And I know there's still many of you I have yet to meet with, and I look forward to having that opportunity in the coming weeks and months. But one of the questions that keeps coming up that a number of you have asked me is how it is that I came to be doing this, how it is that I came to be standing up here, feeling called to ministry. You know, I think it's a natural question whenever someone at a younger age is a clergy person. I mean, it's not something that's common in my generation. And so as I was reading from Ephesians, this letter, thinking about the various callings to which we all are called, I've been thinking about my own sense of call, my own sense of trying to live that life that God has called me to, and what it is that has brought me here. And so I think this sermon may be more testimonial than sermon, a chance to share some of my story in hopes that it may touch some of you in your stories, you know, in whatever you have found your vocations. And chances are that's not a call to the priesthood or to ordained ministry. So then you'd probably have a few more people up here with me. But I think that sense of that idea of call often gets talked about in church context in reference to ordained ministry. But I think it's something useful to think about our vocation, no matter what it is that we do in our lives, no matter how it is that we spend our time, to think about how we engage ourselves, whatever that is an opportunity to reflect God's love into the world. I grew up in the church. I was born and raised an Episcopalian. My parents brought me to the Church of the Good Shepherd in Hayesville, North Carolina. We went most Sundays, and it was something that was a part of my life. And, you know, it was largely what we did on Sundays, at first, as a young person, it wasn't a lot more than that. And then over time, there was a deacon in that church who really saw his ministry as being to the young people of the community. He also worked in the schools and really took a group of us, like teenage guys, under his wing, started this Bible study with us, where we would walk over to the Methodist church downtown after school and skateboard in the parking lot. And then he would finally corral us and get us into the parish hall and have us sit down to read the Bible, but more than anything, to talk about our lives, to ask questions about growing up, about what was right and what was wrong. And I think what was most important about those meetings was not the passages that we were reading, but that we had someone who told us and who reflected to us that what we had to say was valuable, that our questions, that our wonderings, that our curiosities meant something, who treated us at 13 years old like our opinions mattered, and also helped us to think about our lives in terms of where God was and what God was doing, how God was present within us, to us, and in the world around us. And something about that just resonated with me. Something about that stuck. That seed that was planted continued to grow. And throughout my adolescent years, prayer, the language of prayer, became something I could take comfort in. That I found myself able to bring things to God that I struggled to put words to in other contexts. And the little church in our community that we went to was always open. And so once I had my driver's license, there'd be nights where I'd come home from hanging out with friends, or whenever something was just kind of bothering me. And I knew that I could pull into that church parking lot, enter into that darkened sanctuary, just kneel by the altar, sit in a pew, and just wrestle with God, wrestle with whatever it was that was going on in my life. And something about that, it stuck. And the church continued to be a part of my life. And I explored other interests. I pursued other passions. I took botany classes, and I learned to speak Russian. And I spent a year teaching English in the Republic of Georgia, and had all of these different disparate experiences that were wonderful and incredibly life-giving. But over time, I kept coming back to the church. That, as I, even through those other things that I wanted to do, that path kept veering back. And I kept having this sense that I was being called to something in the church. And I ultimately found the church to be the place where I could take all of these different threads, all of these different interests that I'd cultivated, these experiences that I had, and make sense of them and have them hold together. Doing this is where I could find the sort of fullness of myself expressed. Ultimately working towards and being ordained, doing ministry in the church, was where I found a sense of peace and resolve, that this is what I ought to be doing. And I think that sense of peace and resolve that you ought to be doing isn't something that's limited to the church. I hear others describe a similar experience whenever it is that they have found that thing that they are called to. That is, I've talked to lawyers who have been advocating on behalf of detainees who find that same sense of resolve, that even as hard as the work is, that is what they ought to be doing. I think of my own mother, who became a teacher somewhat later. Years has been living into that calling, has found that vocation. And I think it's easy to equate vocation. I think that is often, we are such a career-driven society, but that's not the only place where we find our callings. I think all of those identities that we take on can be a part of that calling, whether that's as a spouse, as a parent. I've certainly realized over the past 2 weeks the extent to which that has to be a calling, or else I don't know why anyone does it. As exhausting as it is, it's also so life-giving. But vocations come in so many different forms. And I think what Paul is getting at in this letter is that our whole lives can be a vocation, something that we are called to, as long as we are living out of this place of intentionality, as long as we are seeking to let everything that we do, every interaction that we have, every way that we use our time, be open to the potential to reflect God's love through it. And that can touch every single part of our life. Every time that we have an interaction with another person, every space that we move through. And what Paul is calling us to is to lead a life of love, first and foremost. To let love transform us and shape us, to take the gift of Christ's love that has been given to us and let it radiate throughout our whole lives. In our current day, there's a lot of talk of seeking work-life balance. And I think embedded in that, while it is helpful to think about having good boundaries of how we use our time and make sure we're not exhausting ourselves in one area at the expense of another. I think maybe a more helpful paradigm is to think of work-life integration, to view ourselves not as separate people in the separate spaces that we occupy, but to seek to be a whole person, to know that everything that we do and all the places, all the activities, all the relationships we have, in each of those areas that we are reflecting the same love, the love of God that has been given to us. That is the work of discernment, figuring out what our vocation is. And it's difficult work, and it changes over time. I'm looking out at a group of people who represent a lot of different ages and generations. I'm sure so many of you could talk about how your vocation has changed over time. As some of you as you have taken on careers and had children and watched those children go off to college and lead their own lives and have become grandparents and have started volunteering places that, that your your journeys have taken you to places that you probably could never have imagined. And I hope for your sake that you've found meaning in each of those stages and know that God has things in store for you yet that you probably can't imagine, and that journey will continue, and that we never stop leading these lives that are capable of reflecting God's love. And that's one of the places where the church, I think, has something to offer us and can serve us, is that we don't do that discernment alone, that we shouldn't feel like we're alone and having to figure out what it is that God is saying to us, where it is that God is calling to us. That's the role of the community. That's what, as Paul talks about, the whole body of Christ being built up, every ligament joined to every other. It's this vivid metaphor of a body with individual parts, yet that still move together, that still help one another. So my prayer for St. George's and for all of us is that we can provide that space for one another to do that work of discernment, to hear how God is leading us forward, to come to know deeper how we are being called to serve God and to serve one another, and how our lives can reflect that love that we have been given. Amen.